We interrupted you. You may continue.
You've completed that. Looks like you completed the interview you conducted on the 16th of October, 1991. Is that correct?
That's true.
Did there come a time that you returned to again interview Mr. Dahmer?
Yes, I did on October 23rd, 1991, again in the Milwaukee County Safety Building, and that was a 3-hour interview.
All right, and did you do it again? You and he spoke together. Are you alone during these interviews with him?
Yes, I am.
And you're in a somewhat private, in a private room, basically.
That's true.
Please proceed.
He brought me up to date. He told me he had a visit from his mother, and said she was still supportive of him, even in spite of his legal difficulties. And he mentioned that he never stopped drinking alcohol, and that he drank primarily during the weekends and while living in Milwaukee, and again confirmed that DePaul was his only alcoholic treatment program. He then told me that his first sexual experience was when he was 14 years old, and it was with a 13-year-old boy from across the street, and they had a tree fort, F-O-R-T, and undressed and played with each other and kissed each other. This happened a couple times, and this individual had been his friend for a few years, and they would approach each other, and was by mutual consent. Mr. Dahmer, I asked, and Mr. Dahmer said he did not initiate it, or he did not, was not the aggressor, so to speak, and that this behavior occurred around 7th or 8th grade. Heterosexually, he said he never tried to initiate a relationship, and that he has not had heterosexual interest or desire. He did not date or call girls over the years. He said, quote, "I knew where I stood. I knew I was gay," unquote. He said feeling this way and realizing this was not that upsetting or traumatic to him years ago. He became aware of his interest, quote, "interest in the physique of better-looking guys," unquote. And he said his involvement with the 13-year-old boy was an isolated incident, unquote. So the point there is that when he...
I think just so there's no confusion in the jury's mind, because there's another 13-year-old Laotian boy. Would you read that full sentence?
Well, a 13-year-old boy from across the street was an isolated incident.
He's speaking of his involvement with his...
neighborhood boy.
Pardon?
The neighborhood boy.
The neighborhood boy when he was a young man.
Right.
Right.
But the important thing here is that when he realizes his gayness, that this is not, he implied it wasn't that devastating or traumatic for him, as it sometimes is. In junior high school, he said he had a, quote, "fascination with road kills," unquote. And these are dogs killed on the road. He denied purposefully killing any animals and cutting them up. But he said he picked up the animals off the road and he wanted to see what was inside of them. This is certainly a forerunner of things to come. He was, quote, "curious," unquote. He said he was going to deflesh and clean the skeleton of a particular large dog, but he never finished this project. He said this behavior with the roadkills was not sexually motivated, and he did not derive sexual pleasure or stimulation from this. And said this behavior with the dead animals lasted for a couple years, and that he was involved with about 10 animals altogether, mostly dogs and a few raccoons. And this behavior lasted until he was about 17 years old, or until he was in his junior year of high school, and then he lost interest in this.
There's then a discussion about the death of Stephen Hicks.
Yes, yes. He said he was living alone at home for a couple weeks, and after his mother moved to Chippewa Falls, father was living 5 miles away in a motel. He had been drinking, Mr. Dahmer, not father, and picked up a hitchhiker, and he gave the name of the road in Bath. He said a young man with a bare back and short pants, and this occurred in June or July. And he returned home and they had some beer. He did not mention marijuana, which is mentioned in the confession that marijuana was also involved. But he said he was attracted to this boy, And then Hicks wanted to return to his destination, and he realized Hicks was not gay, but he wanted Hicks to stay. A fundamental feature in this case is the victims want to leave. Mr. Dahmer wants them to stay. While Hicks was sitting down, Mr. Dahmer hit Mr. Hicks by surprise from behind on the head with a barbell. It knocked him out. He said they had been together for about 90 minutes before the assault, and he again said that he had an interest in Mr. Hicks's physique. And then at this time, he also entered an aside that he denied hating gays or blacks as a reason why he hit Mr. Hicks or other people. He denied previous approaches or attempts to make homosexual contact, meaning prior to this, he just had not had a contact, he had not had a homosexual outlet, had not had a homosexual relationship. So this is relevant to the development of his later behavior. He said his picking up Hicks was his first approach. He said he wanted, quote,
Doctor, I've been following what you're saying. When it is something that you're interpreting, would you just be kind enough to say my interpretation of that is such and such? Because I just don't want anybody to get confused that that's what he is saying, that this is relevant to his behavior later. That's not in your report. That's your... So would you do that for us, please?
That's my editorializing as we proceed.
No problem you doing it. Just let us know when you do it.
He said he wondered, quote, how do I get this guy to stay, unquote. He did not ask him to stay and did not offer him any money. He had the idea, and I asked him this, he had the idea to hit him over the head for about a half hour. He was able to, this is my comment, he was able to have that idea consciously for that long a time. He said they were drinking beer and gave the brand name, and he was intoxicated. He then strangled him with a barbell, and he said, quote, I was pretty panicked. Quote, I didn't want to get caught, so I went all the way and finished it, meaning strangled him. I cracked his skull, unquote. He then said he killed him to get rid of a witness and to end Hicks' suffering. He said he thought Hicks probably would have been disabled because of the head injury. And recall, this is not in the notes, but he implied that there was clearly a crushing skull injury. There was an indentation, and he assumed that because of this, Mr. Hicks would be disabled. He then said, quote, I definitely wanted to make sure no one found out about it, unquote, what had happened. And again, my inference from this is that this certainly reflects that, or suggests that he had some appreciation of the wrongfulness of what he was doing. He said he'd been drinking throughout that day and really felt, quote, panicked, unquote, after he killed Hicks. He said the alcohol, quote, clouded my thinking, unquote. And again, my inference is that this again suggests that alcohol played a part in the behavior. He said he sat on the bed and wondered, quote, what should I do now, unquote. A couple hours later, he took the body to the crawl space and waited for darkness. He said he did not sleep that night and felt, quote, too horrified, unquote. He did not attempt anything sexual prior to the assault or afterwards. But the next day, he did masturbate in front of the body and touch the body in the chest and the penis area, but he did not have oral sex. But he did admit that he was aroused by the body. And then I asked him, and he said he had heard of necrophilia before. And he said his sexual interest prior to the Hicks murder was to be with someone who was alive. He denied having any prior thoughts or fantasies about necrophilia or being involved sexually with someone after their death. He said he was, quote, very worried, unquote, about his legal situation. He knew that no one was coming back to the house, but But he said, quote, "But I had to dispose of the evidence," unquote, and my inference of that is, again, is talking about his appreciation of the legal situation and the trouble he was in. The next,
That is, as they're ongoing, going over these materials, this brings to mind the wrongfulness prong of the insanity issue, and that's something you're taking note of in your own mind as you're proceeding, that he appreciates this is wrong, and that's why he's going to hide the body and so on.
that's true. The next day, the second day, he bought a hunting knife and then masturbated again. And he cut open the body to view his insides. And then he talked about dismembering. And he said he did this, quote, "to make him light enough to carry," unquote. And he again confirmed that this was not sexually motivated behavior, the cutting part, but disposal behavior. During the second night, he took trash bags with the parts to a large ravine, which was outside of town. He did this around 3 a.m, and on his way to the ravine, he was stopped by the police for driving left of center. The policeman called for a backup. Mr. Dahmer passed the sobriety test. The policeman asked him what was in the back seat, and he told the policeman that it was trash for the landfill. And when asked why he was out so late, he said he was upset with his parents' divorce, and he decided to go for a, quote, late drive, unquote. The policeman shined a light in the back seat, and this made him, quote, really nervous, unquote.
Again, to this, I won't interrupt each time, but again, this bears on your considerations of his appreciation of the wrongfulness of his conduct. Is that correct?
Yes, yes, it does. He was not arrested and returned home. He then made the comment that one of the officers he dealt with that during those early morning hours years ago is still on the force and was one of the officers that came to Milwaukee to interview him in regard to the present charges. Then Mr. Dahmer said, quote, "I wish I had been caught. It would have put a stop to it," unquote. The next morning, he put the bags with the body parts in a 10-foot drainage pipe in his backyard and smashed the opening of the pipe closed. A few years later, after his discharge from the Army and while living back home for about 6 months with his father and stepmother, he opened up the pipe when his parents were gone. He found the bones and broke them up with a rock and scattered the pieces. He said, quote, "small pieces so they would not be identified," unquote. At the time of the homicide, he said he threw the knife and Mr. Hicks's necklace over a bridge. This was about 2 weeks later after the assault, and then he later burned Mr. Hicks's clothes in an outside trash burner.
Again, this activity, disposing of evidence, destroying evidence, is all indicative of his appreciation of the wrongfulness of his conduct. Is that correct?
That's true.
Now, with all due respect, I don't have any problems about the inquiry. If the constable is leading, if the doctor wants to say that, it's
The
fine.
question is a leading question. No question about it, Mr. Boyd.
He then told me that in over half the homicides, the police would never have known these are the Milwaukee cases and he would not be charged. But he said he wants, quote, "nothing concealed," unquote, and that is why he's been so cooperative. He blamed the Hicks homicide as a, quote, "big factor," unquote, in his starting to abuse alcohol, and that alcohol helped him not to think about it, and that there was nothing in the news or on TV about Hicks, and he was never questioned by the police. He said he was, quote, "curious," unquote, when he was back living at home after the Army, and he decided to, quote, "completely dispose of the evidence," unquote. And that was involved, meaning finding the bones again and breaking them up again. He says Hicks' death was always, quote, "in the back of my mind. I drank the memories away," unquote. He did not know Hicks' family. He said it was a, quote, "a horror that I wanted to forget," unquote. They did not have a fight prior to the assault, he and Hicks. He said he wanted to knock Hicks out because he would then have, quote, "control over him," unquote. When asked about the other homicides, he said he wanted them incapacitated quote, the ability to exercise complete control over someone, unquote. He said he was attracted to their looks and, quote, they're with me and I can keep them, unquote. He denied, again, getting back to this abandonment issue, if this isn't one of Mr. Dahmer's things, he denied any previous clinging type behavior, meaning clinging to other people and being very intolerant to being left alone or being abandoned. This was an earlier concern, and he denied this. He said his mother's leaving was not that upsetting to him, and that her leaving was discussed, and that he stayed there because he's going to start college. He said her leaving provided him a, quote, window of opportunity to bring someone home, unquote, for homosexual contact. Again, implying that when she was there, of course, he was restricted in this type of behavior. That he then commented on the publicity, and he disagreed with some of it, and he definitely denied being molested during his childhood by his parents or relatives or anyone. And he definitely denied the formulation that he was in any way a victim of childhood sexual abuse.
Doctor, at this juncture, although he told you that he received and disagreed with some of the articles, he also told you he hadn't read any of them.
So this is
That's right. That's
Okay, this is Mr. McCann's examination, and I appreciate Mr. Boyle once in a while, maybe it's a little helpful in that it saves some time on cross-examination, but if Mr. McCann says he doesn't want that to happen, I think it's Mr. McCann's examination.
All right, I understand it just take a lot longer. Just read what he has there, I'll do that.
according to law, Mr. Boyle doesn't know what was said. He wasn't at this meeting. He doesn't know if Mr. Dahmer said anything of
I'm not
the.
asking for any argument. Mr. McCann, it's your examination, and if you don't want Mr. Boyle interrupting, other than to make an objection, that's your prerogative.
Yes, he had not read anything about his case. He then said, quote, I was attracted to him, referring to Mr. Hicks, enough that I wanted to keep him. That was the first time, unquote. While he was in Germany, he said he bought male pornographic magazines and routinely masturbated on a daily basis. He said he started masturbating while in junior high school, and he called it a, quote, obsession to relieve tension, unquote. For stimulation or arousal, he would use homosexual videos and pictures. He said after the Hicks homicide, he said he was deterred from any further contacts, and that he also said he was, quote, too busy with college and the Army and Miami, unquote. When asked about his sexual feelings during that time, he said his practice was to, quote, always, unquote, have male magazines available for masturbation purposes. In the Army, he said he had no opportunity, unquote, and was not approached for homosexual purposes. In Miami, he said he was, quote, too busy working. I never had anyone to take back to a hotel, unquote. He said he continued to drink excessively during those years to help suppress his memories. And he said he became, quote, hooked, unquote, on beer and mixed drinks by that time. Again, referring to further reflecting on his chronic alcoholism. After Hicks, I asked him, and he said he did not re-experience again the feeling of separation or somebody wanting to leave him again, like he experienced with Mr. Hicks. He also never told anybody about what happened to Hicks. When asked about the killing the animals during his childhood, he said his animal behavior only occurred with animals killed on the road. He did not say parts of the animals except for the one time he was going to mount the skeleton of a large dog, but he did not finish that project. In Miami, he did not have a car and worked long hours and had little money. And he did not have any homosexual contacts and did not go to gay bars. And he worked in the tourist section of town, and he implied to me that he was a, quote, naive, unquote, gay individual at that time, and was just not sure the let's say, the ropes. And
What significance there was in his not engaging in any violent activity while he was in the Army, any sexually assaultive activity.
well, he certainly, whatever his desires or motivations or fantasies were, they were certainly at least under control at that time.
And the fact that none of such activities occurred in Miami, and what did you infer from that?
Pretty much the same thing. That his being busy and being occupied does help his control. He then returned to his father and stepmother in Bath and was there for about 6 months and continued to abuse alcohol. This led to arguments, and it was father's idea that he should return to grandmother's in West Dallas, even though Mr. Dahmer, did not want to. He had visited grandmother a few times during his childhood. He arrived in West Dallas around December of 1981, and he looked for work to help grandmother around the yard, and said his grandmother was, quote, heavily, unquote, into church activities. Mr. Dahmer tried to straighten his life out, and he went to church and did not drink alcohol for a couple of years. He stopped masturbating and using men's magazines and went to a church. He did admit that his grandmother was upset with his drinking, and he did not drink for a couple of years. He lived with grandmother for 8 or 9 years, but he continued to have homosexual desires, quote, but I did my best to suppress them, unquote.
What did you, the implication, the inference you draw from this period with respect to capacity to control?
Well, again, his desires and interests were pretty much under control during that time. During that time, he was at a local library, and another male dropped him a note at his table inviting him to come down to a lower level bathroom. And he said the note said, quote, and I'll give you a blowjob, unquote. Mr. Dahmer did not follow through with this invitation because he wanted to, as he said, not humble, unquote, and stay on the straight path he was trying to stay on. But he said that after this episode, his sexual desires increased and his willpower lessened, and he started, quote, slowly, unquote, drinking again on weekends, and he said the drinking enhanced his homosexual desires. He then started going to bookstores and looking at magazines, and again started masturbating. He did not know where the gay bars were, but he found out in the pornographic bookstores. And then around 1985 or 1986, he started going to gay bars, and he said this, quote, fueled my desire, unquote. He found out what a bath club was, and by this time, he had stopped going to church. He mentioned the name of a local bath club and how much it cost to stay there, and what they did there, like looking at male videos and in the lounge, and he and the other men there would sit around and they were wearing towels. He told me this was not illegal behavior, but that anal intercourse at these places was about all that was illegal. He had an annual membership for $25. He went there on weekends, even while he was living with his grandmother. He said that she did not know where he was, and his parents did not know he was gay. He had, quote, one-night stands, unquote, at the bathhouse. And it was my interpretation that this was his attorney's first mutual consensual homosexual experiences at these bathhouses.
This would be as an adult.
As an adult with a consenting male, yes. He went to the bathhouse for a couple years, and after it closed, he would pick up men and go to a couple Milwaukee hotels and gave the names. This would be on Saturday nights and after leaving a bar. He said the bathhouse closed because of a possible tuberculosis problem, and he did not tell me that he was apparently asked to leave because of the drugging. He was aware of the AIDS issue, and occasionally would have anal intercourse, but would then use a condom. He said he did not like anal intercourse being done to him, but he just wanted to, quote, lay around, hug, and kiss, unquote, which he called soft sex. He then estimated that he had been with 200 different men, ages 18 to the late 60s.
This was in the
First interview, he had mentioned the figure 100. Is that correct?
Something like that, yes.
So this was a modification upward?
Yes. He said, quote, you don't develop a lasting friendship there, unquote, referring to the bathhouses. At the bathhouse, he was usually with someone new every time. Most of the males there did not interest him. Only a few of them were, quote, nice looking, unquote. And those were the only ones he would bother trying to pick up. When asked, he said he was approached himself by less desirable men, and he would then just make small talk with them and then turn them down. The ones that he was attracted to usually did not approach him, but he would approach the ones he liked, and sometimes they would agree, and sometimes they would not. Sometimes he would have to settle for a less desirable man, and especially after he had been drinking. On about 50% of the times, the attractive men would go with him, and he implied that he was not routinely rejected or disappointed, and he was not devastated by the rejections when turned down. And he said, quote, that's to be expected, unquote. And he said that the men have, quote, very shallow relationships, unquote, amongst each other. What I was driving at here was pretty much how did he feel about himself, his attractiveness, his bargaining power with other men. Is he a completely unwanted gay person, and he's not even having any success in that realm, but he implied that he was somewhat in the middle of the pack, so to speak. Again, when asked, he said he never had a sustained lover or a steady relationship with another gay person, and implied that it was not his goal to have such a relationship or steady boyfriend, but he wanted to play the field, which was his words. He was not devastated that he did not have a steady lover, but he thought it might have been, quote, nice, unquote, to have such a relationship. He then said that most of the men tend to play the field and not have a steady lover, but he later corrected me on this in a later interview. While living at grandmother's, he was not able to bring people home because she was there. He would be gone on Saturday nights and gave mother a work excuse as to why he was gone. He would pick someone up and go to one of the hotels. He would only have a sexual contact like this on Saturday and not during the week.
This is what do you draw from that?
Well, again, he's timing when he engages in his sexual behavior. He has a desire, of course, throughout the week. He has his interests, he has a motivation, but he is picking and choosing or channeling when he's going to follow through with his desires. I would say at this point in the history, we start a new phase in this whole scenario, and this is the phase of drugging. He told me that while at the bath club, he started using a sleeping pill, and that this was pretty much prompted in part by if his partner wanted to have heavy anal sex, unquote, he did not want to. So he would slip his partner the sleeping pill in their liquor in order to avoid having anal intercourse. The problem there is that, and this is not in my notes, but if the person wanted to have anal intercourse with Mr. Dahmer and he didn't want to, then of course the male that was with him would leave. And that of course he did not want that person to leave, but he also didn't want to have anal intercourse. He wanted to do his thing with his partner. So in order to solve that bind, he said he got into the drugging routine. He would then enjoy them physically while they were passed out, quote, the warmth of their company and have oral sex, unquote. He said if he did not cooperate in anal intercourse with his partner, then the partner would usually leave after 1 or 2 hours, and therefore he had to incapacitate them to keep them there. He said the sleeping pill was a way to keep them there all night, unquote. While his partner was passed out, he would lay on top of him, caress him, and kiss him. He said they were attractive even though they were passed out. He would use his, excuse me.
What was then from your discussion with him, what was the intended purpose then of protect himself from anal intercourse and then do what himself?
Prolong the availability of his homosexual contact. So again, this is, again, I'm interpreting. This is substitute behavior. He's now substituting a vehicle, V-I-C-H-L-E, a program, a substitute pattern of behavior in order to satisfy his sexual needs. It's not being done with a fully cooperative boyfriend. The only way he can have it his way is through the drugging program, and then the person is completely passive and cooperative while, of course, unconscious. He would offer them drinks in his room, and he said they did not serve alcohol downstairs in the bathhouse. They just had a juice bar. He then told me about the sleeping pills and where he got them and how long he had them, and that he would use a bogus complaint of having trouble sleeping with his doctor. I then asked him, and he said that he has told.
So just one point on that.
Yes.
You indicate then that he would have the, what did he say about how frequently he would have the prescriptions refilled?
He used the term, quote, many times, unquote, over a 2-year period of time.
He mentioned a particular doctor. That doctor has testified, Dr. Olson, that he visited him for those prescriptions.
That's true. I then asked him if he had shared all this information with the other examiners or people involved. And he said that about all that he told me that was new was related to this discrepancy between his scattering the bones of Hicks 2 weeks after the homicide, when it was really a few years later.
Doctor, I didn't hear the first part of your answer. Would you give?
It's the paragraph there on page 18.
No, I didn't. Just tailed off.
I'm sorry.
What you said.
That I asked him, is anything I'm hearing new? And he implied that he's told everything that he's told me to other people, but that he implied that I was the first to hear about the change in when he scattered the Hicks bones. Apparently he had mentioned 2 weeks after the homicide or before, and he said it was really a few years later. He said the sleeping pill was very, quote, very fast acting, and of course, when asked, he said he usually was not accused by the partner of being drugged. And but he said this did happen once or twice in Chicago. And then he said he went to Chicago, quote, many times, unquote, after the Milwaukee place was closed. And he went to 2 bathhouses in Chicago, and he gave the names of those 2 clubs and their addresses. He said the Chicago clubs were 3 times bigger than the Milwaukee club, and he used the sleeping potion on a regular basis, quote, almost every time. It made things easier. Then I wouldn't have to worry about doing things that I didn't want to do, unquote, which reflects on his motive for using the sleeping pill, and again, to not want to have to do homosexual behavior that he didn't like doing. Once or twice, the partner would be upset when he realized he had been drugged. One of these individuals in Chicago hit him, and when asked, he said he was the only one that he knew of that was drugging partners. So he was unique in this regard.
Let's go into a discussion about the Stephen Twomey death in November of '87.
Yes, we do. He said this was the first one in Milwaukee, and he picked up an individual at one of the local taverns, gave the name, a white male. They went to this hotel.
We have mentioned the names of the taverns and the hotel, and I think it would be of assistance to the jury to mention that.
Okay, I'm just trying to not involve minimize the publicity. The 219 Club, and they went went to the Ambassador Hotel. He said they were planning on a normal night, unquote. He gave this individual the sleeping mixture, and the partner passed out. Mr. Dahmer woke up lying on top of the partner in the park. He said the partner had a broken rib, and Mr. Dahmer had bruised forearms, and he assumed that he had beaten his partner to death. He said they'd been drinking 151 proof rum, quote, drinking very heavy, unquote. He said he had no intentions of hurting this individual, and that, quote, it shocked the hell out of me, unquote. He was heavily bruised throughout the chest area, meaning the victim, and that blood was coming out of the victim's mouth, and that he was dead. And he estimated this was around 1987. He denied any recollection of beating him and assumed he, quote, blacked out, unquote. And that, quote, I had no intention of doing anything violent to him, unquote. He did not know what happened and could not find the bottle of rum. My interjection here is if he truly has no memory of that, the leading explanation would be an alcoholic amnesia or alcoholic blackout. He did not, he said he woke up that Sunday morning and did not know why it happened. He did not know what to do next. Quote, the whole thing started all over again, referring to first time since Hicks, unquote. He put the body in a closet at the hotel. He then went to a mall and bought a large suitcase with wheels on it, and he paid $35. He stayed at the hotel until 1 a.m. Well, he stayed in the hotel another day, and he stayed until 1 a.m. and then went down in the elevator. In my interpretation there, he was clearly waiting for the hotel to quiet. When is a safe time to carry out this behavior of removing the body from the hotel? And the taxi driver helped him put the body into the trunk, and they went to grandmother's house. And I asked him why he didn't call the police and just report what happened. He said it never crossed his mind. And he said, unquote, I assumed they would accuse me, unquote.
Again,
What, if anything, do you draw or infer from the efforts to conceal what transpired in the hotel?
This is all behavior that I infer that, he had the presence of mind to appreciate the illegality of what he was doing and the trouble he was in. The legal aspects of his behavior was clearly on his mind, and he's behaving in according with trying to, the detection and evidence issue. At grandmother's house, put the suitcase in a fruit cellar in the basement, and it was Thanksgiving time, and father, stepmother, and an aunt and an uncle were there for Thanksgiving. I remember asking, he said it was cold outside and the body was, quote, preserved, unquote, because of the cold weather. On the following Monday, when grandmother had left for church, he defleshed, unquote, which was his word, the body near a drain in the basement, and he put the parts in 3 trash bags. He said he always, quote, triple bagged so the weight would not rip through. You don't want spilling. He said fist-sized pieces of flesh, about 30 pounds per bag, unquote. When asked why he didn't just cut the limbs off and put them in a trash bag, he said that the, quote, limbs might have been discovered, unquote. Meaning, from what I recall, the bones can poke through a bag or something like that. He put the bones in a blanket and crushed them and put them in bags. He set out about 5 trash bags for pickup on Monday morning and cleaned up the basement. And in the police reports, they described some of the ways he cleaned up and pouring things down the drain to cut down on the smell and things. A week later, he threw the suitcase in the trash the next Monday morning pickup. Back at the hotel in regard to this case, he said he remembered kissing and engaging in mutual masturbation and the victim passing out, Mr. Toomey, and then he passed out. He did not remember any bitter.
Go further, would you draw what inference?
Suggest to the jury what inferences you drew from the disposal activity, the packing it in the bag, the smashing of the bones, what inferences you drew on that with respect to the capacity to appreciate wrongfulness?
These are steps that he's engaging in, behaviors he's going through that you can, a reasonable inference, in my opinion, is that he clearly was appreciated, had the presence of mind, that he was tuned into the illegality of his situation. The last thing in the world he wanted to do was to have this stuff discovered.
I just pretty missed that whole back into that answer. You repeat it, Madam Chair.
I said that.
No, let her.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay, yeah.
These are steps that he's engaging in, behavior that he's going through is a reasonable inference. In my opinion, he clearly had the presence of mind and knew the illegality of the situation. The last thing in the world he would want to do was have this stuff discovered.
The last thing in the world was what?
Have this stuff discovered.
This stuff. Thanks.
Sorry, would you return to the hotel then?
Well, he did not remember any bitterness or reasons to fight with Mr. Toomey. He said that when he woke up, he was, quote, horrified, unquote, with what he discovered. He said the cutting up and cleaning up at grandmother's was not for sexual purposes, but was strictly, quote, work, unquote, and for disposal purposes. When I asked, he said that during later homicides, he might have gotten some sexual arousal by the dismembering. Then he also said he started taking pictures, and he said he was never questioned about the hotel death, and the death was never apparently reported. He was working or employed during that period of time. He then said that nothing further happened for a couple months and until January, which is this January of '88?
Yes.
And he started returning to bars. He said an individual was waiting for a bus in front of the 219 Club. It was on a Saturday evening, and this individual, quote, he caught my eye, unquote. He offered him $50 to watch videos, and they took a bus to 57th and National, and then walked to grandmother's house. He said this was the first time he ever brought anybody alive to grandmother's house. He said the hotel incident made him, quote, bolder. I was drunk enough. I took my chances, unquote.
Just so the jury is clear, you're speaking now of the James Dockstader incident, is that correct?
After the hotel death, after the Mr. Toomey, he said, he implied that because of what happened, he now felt, quote, bolder, and also said he was drunk enough and he was going to take his chances, unquote. And now we start a new era of people coming to grandmother's, where before grandmother's was somewhat of a deterrent. They undressed in the living room. This is talking about Mr. Dockstader now, I believe, correct?
Yes, sir.
And they laid on each other, engaged in homosexual behavior. And he said this Mr. Dockstader, this particular individual, was, quote, very attractive, unquote. This individual said he had to be home the next morning. He was given the sleeping mixture, and they went to the basement, and Mr. Dockstader passed out. He did not want this individual to leave. Mr. Dahmer said he was, quote, very aroused. He had a very good physique, unquote. On the floor, he had sex with him while the partner was passed out. Quote, it was not enough to satisfy me. I wanted to be with him longer, unquote. When asked why he just didn't use more sleeping potion to keep him passed out longer, he said that grandmother would eventually be waking up. Quote, so I opted for the strangling method, unquote. He then proceeded to choke him to death, and he admitted that he was, quote, drunk, unquote, during that time. He said they were drinking decaffeinated coffee and Irish cream, and that he was concerned about this particular partner waking up and getting him, Mr. Dahmer, into trouble. He said he strangled him in order to, quote, keep complete control. I could still enjoy his physique, even though he's dead, and they can still be very attractive. He had a perfect body, unquote.
With respect to his expressed concern just there about waking up and then he, Mr. Dahmer, getting into trouble, what, if any, inferences did you draw with respect to that and then the responsibility issues?
Well, he implied that when you drug somebody, that sometimes the people may realize they were drugged and that he could get in trouble for doing this. So certainly, he said that in this particular case, he was concerned about that, and that's in part one of the reasons why he committed the cause of the death.
When he spoke of enjoying his physique, what was the discussion there? What was he referring to at that point?
Exactly what he liked about the body, I do not know. May I continue?
Yes, sir.
I then made the comment that you should have a mannequin. And he said that, yes, indeed, he had earlier brought a home mannequin from a local store, and that he went to an Army surplus store and bought a sleeping bag cover or tarp, and he waited in the store until after closing. And then when no one was in the store, he put the mannequin in the tarp and walked out of the store. And he also, the clothes on the mannequin, he also kept. This is when he's living with grandmother's. And he said he used the mannequin for sexual purposes for about a month. I have here, he masturbated to the mannequin. I don't know if that's to or on, but he'd masturbated to the mannequin and undressed it. He kept it for about a month, and then grandmother discovered it in the closet. And then he had to throw it out in the trash.
Is there a particular psychiatric name for using a mannequin or statute for such a purpose?
Oh, not officially, but I would assume you could probably coin one. But
Sometimes referred to as Pygmalianism.
I don't know.
No.
Again, we had to terminate our interview because of the time on the jail routine. And these are, again, kind of last minute questions. And he said that later homicides get, quote, stranger, unquote. And then he told me about eating body parts of two victims, quote, 10 pounds of muscle and one heart, unquote. When asked how he prepared them, he said he, quote, fried them in a skillet and that they tasted like beef, unquote. When asked why he would do this, he said he was, quote, curious that they were part of me. I felt some thrill, unquote. He also said when he began saving body parts, quote, for remembrance, not a total waste, unquote. When asked about the illegality of what he was doing, he said, quote, it became a compulsion, my main focus for living, implying his desire to have homosexual experience in this fashion. He implied that the body parts later had value to him, and that ended our second interview.
And that had been about 3 hours or so, the second interview?
2 o'clock to 5 o'clock on October 23rd, 1991.
There came a time then that you returned to meet with Mr. Dahmer, did there not?
Yes, I did.
And that was on the 13th day of November in 1991?
That's true, in the same room here in the safety building from 1 o'clock to 4:30 in the afternoon.
In the interval between this, would you be yourself digesting more information that you'd be receiving from my office or through other sources, assessing that, reviewing your notes, determining what further questions you might wish to put?
Yes, material was coming in. Material was being provided.
Then you returned to the safety building here on November 13, 1991, to the same room and initiated your third interview of Mr. Dahmer. Is that correct?
That's true.
just so while we make it, is that Mr. Dahmer here in the courtroom?
Stipulate, yeah.
And,
Yes, he is.
and were you again in the room with him alone?
Yes, I was.
And it's just you and he, and you're talking back and forth?
That's true.
Would you proceed to communicate to the jury what transpired at the third interview of Mr. Dahmer, the one of November 13, 1991?
Okay, we have to hold up for a minute so the reporter can change her papers. Okay, we may continue at this point.
Oh, I mentioned that he had talked to any detectives for about 2 months. And about his future, he made the comment of, quote, endless years of nothingness, unquote.
I think at this point, maybe let's skip the rest of that
Right.
paragraph. It relates to issues that
Right.
court will instruct on.
He mentioned having a neurological evaluation scheduled in the near future. He mentioned that he had psychological testing by Dr. Smale and Anderson. And I tried to develop some time frames for myself and some organization to this volume of data here. When asked, he said he had 3 residences in Milwaukee. The first with his grandmother, and he said 4 homicides took place there. And then the second residence was at 24th and Wells for about 6 months. On 86, 87, and while there, he was only involved with, quote, just pictures, no violence there, unquote. And the third residence was at 25th Street, and he moved there in late 1989, and that's where he was living until his arrest. And he said all the other homicides took place there, the remaining 12. He denied that any homicides occurred anywhere else except the original one in Ohio.
Was it your understanding that he was including the Tuomi, the disposal of the Tuomi body as among the 4 homicides occurring at the grandmother's house?
Yes. Yes.
Although technically it occurred at the Ambassador Hotel.
He also said he was not being charged in that case. He said the third homicide, or the first at his grandmother's house, and this is, this time he thought his name was Doc Stater, and he said that...
Just so it's clear to the jury, the first homicide was Hicks, is that correct?
Yeah, but the first at grandmother's house.
No, I'm speaking now of the first, because when you say the third at the first at grandmother's house, the first was Hicks, is that correct, in Bath, Ohio?
Yes.
Second one was the death at the Ambassador Hotel of Mr. Tomey?
True.
Right, and then you're speaking of the third homicide, which is...
The third historically, but the first at grandmother's house.
Please proceed.
He thought his name was Doc Stater, and he said that this individual was, quote, just there for the evening, a Native American, unquote. He said he was on his way to the 219 bar when he saw Doc Stater standing at the corner, approached him, offered him $50 to return to grandmother's and be videotaped. They took the bus and walked the rest of the way to grandmother's. They were in the living room and, quote, made small talk, unquote, and grandmother was asleep upstairs, and they undressed and laid around on the sofa, unquote, for about an hour. They had oral sex. Doc Stater had to be back in the morning. And they went to the basement, and then Doc Stater drank the mixture. They kissed and laid around for a while, and then Doc Stater passes out, and then Mr. Dahmer strangled him with his hands, quote, it just took a few minutes, unquote, and he expressed surprise that it didn't take longer. When asked why he killed him, he said, quote, that's the only way I could keep him there, unquote. And if I interject, obviously everybody wants to know what is the motive for the killing, and certainly in part This is very much the formulation Mr. Dahmer presented me, that very much the deaths were incurred as a way to keep the people with him. Kept his body for a week, and he did want the body for a period of time. And then we discussed the various choices he had before killing him. He agreed that his first choice would have been to have Mr. Dockstader stay with him for several days or a week alive. Quote, if he would have cooperated, comma, I would not have had to kill him, unquote. Again, interpreting here, well, I'll continue. He said the second, quote, second best alternative was to have him there dead. Quote, he wasn't going to go anywhere, unquote. He said he would fondle and lay with the body, quote, only when the house was empty, unquote. This must have been during the subsequent days. He kept the body in the basement fruit cellar, and the body was nude. He would have anal sex with the body and lay on it. Then he again said that he did not like anal sex done to him, but did enjoy doing it to others. He also said he masturbated before defleshing, unquote, which is his word. He's Mr. Tomey in the basement. And then he mentioned keeping the skulls of Tomey and Dockstader. He again said the reason he killed Dockstader was, quote, the only way to have complete control and have them stay, unquote, for sexual purposes. He wanted them for sexual purposes. An object, quote, their physical attraction was the deciding factor in who I picked, referring to who he picked to pick up or bring home. He said it first crossed his mind to use a body.
Just at this point, in
In terms of the reason that he didn't want them to leave was that for sexual, so he could continue the sexual purposes with the body?
It's a substitute, temporary prolongation of the relationship.
And that is predominantly a sexual relationship.
His interest in them was sexual. Their utilitarian value to him was sexual. It wasn't necessarily friendship, it was sexual. He said it crossed his mind to use a body for sexual purposes when he was about 14 years old and in junior high school. He fantasized having a body to use like a mannequin. He agreed that, quote, the ideal situation, unquote, sexually would be to have the other individual cooperate with him, live with him, and travel with him. The importance here is trying to assess where is this person sexually and what are his preferences and where does his interest and desires lie. And these kind of comments certainly reflect that they're not necessarily pure necrophilic desires, in that I don't have any sexual arousal with only unless they're dead. That's not true. He's implying here that his first choice would be a relationship. But tragically and unfortunately, he said that this alternative, quote, never materialized, unquote. So he did the second best thing. He said he never went on a long weekend or a trip. I asked him with another gay person. He said he never had a close homosexual relationship, and he never met anyone who would do that with him. In my last interview, jumping ahead, I somewhat chided him about this, or that he didn't try hard enough, and that this might have been possible, but he didn't try hard enough, and he tended to agree. He went to the bathhouse in Milwaukee for about 2 years, and no homicides occurred during that time. He said he did experiment with the sleeping mixture first at the bathhouse, and that his bathhouse sexual behavior, quote, kept me satisfied for a while, unquote. And then after the closure of the bathhouse, the homicide started. He said the closing ended his ability to find satisfaction for one night, and he found this frustrating. He was living with his grandmother at the time, and therefore he could not bring some people home to her house. And he denied having any interest in killing any of his sexual partners at the bathhouse. and just settled for the one-night stands. Again, the issue, how much of his drive is necrophilic in nature and how much is not. He's then said his sexual behavior progressed to, quote, wanting more, unquote. He then started using the hotels in Milwaukee and did this for a few months, again, always on weekends. And he went to a hotel about 15 times and about half to each hotel, always on weekends, never during the week because he was at work. He did not have time to go to bars to pick up men during the week because of his job.
Stop at that point and tell the
Jury, what observations or conclusions or inferences you draw from that, that he was restricting these activities and could restrict these activities to weekends.
It's just, he has the interest during the time. The interest is with him. It doesn't go away. The issue is, when does he act on it, do something about it? And such factors as being employed, his job, outside structure like that, he was able to refrain, and he had some control over as to when he followed through with his sexual desires. He said he used the sleeping mixture each time at the hotels, and the individual would wake up and leave. And then he stopped using these hotels after the Tommy death at the hotel. After the Tommy case, he said he took 2 or 3 men back to his grandmother's who he did not kill, and they later left. He said there were 4 homicides at grandmother's, including the Tommy case. When asked how he decided which ones he let go, here these men are showing up at grandmother's and some don't leave and some do. He said, quote, "Those that left I met while I was quite drunk. I lost my attraction to them as I was sobering up," unquote. Interpreting here this, if in fact, and this has been commented on by other people, but basically that the attraction issue was so important to him and that his control was very much related to the attraction issue, and that he could simply let somebody go if he was not attracted. And that relates to the conformity issue.
It mean that he would not have
But if he let the person go, he would enjoy them sexually before they left, but he could forego any activity with a dead body when he decided to let them go. Is that correct?
Yes, he did not feel a need to kill them because he didn't feel that attracted to them, or they weren't the type he wanted to hang on to. At a second residence, he brought one individual back and they had sex and the individual left. And he again said that he did not kill this individual because he did not want to keep him. That same afternoon, he took a picture of a Laotian male, and the police were later called when he was arrested. He said he wasn't going to hotels while living at a second residence, and any homosexual contacts during that time took place in the, quote, viewing booths, unquote, at magazine stores. He and the other gay person would kiss and masturbate each other in the booth. At his third residence, he said 12 homicides took place there. He estimated that 3 individuals came back there with him, and he did not kill them, and they left.
Then you would draw the same
Inferences you drew from the similar decisions that he made at the grandmother's house to presumably would have sex while alive and then forego the decision to have sex with them after death by not killing them.
Right. What reasoning or decision, what reasoning was he doing that determined which ones left and which ones stayed? And he said that in regard to the first individual that left, that he himself, Mr. Dahmer, drank the wrong cup with a mixture in it, and he himself passed out. The other individual left and robbed Mr. Dahmer of about $300. The other 2 individuals that survived or were not killed were there for the night and left in the morning, And when asked why he didn't kill them, he said that sometimes his hangover was so bad that he didn't have the, quote, energy to kill them, unquote, or keep them, or that they were not attractive enough to him. Which again, simply my interpretation, just the fatigue factor or hangover factor, this type of thing, if this was he could refrain if this variable or this factor was there. At least he said this was one of the reasons he refrained in these individuals. He agreed that in total there were only 15 individuals brought back to his third residence. That he only had homosexual contacts at his residence or at the bathhouse in Chicago while living at his third residence.
Did he ever tell you whether or not he was excluded from the bathhouses at Chicago?
Excluded, kicked out? No.
So the best of your knowledge, he always, up to the day of arrest, he always had access to the bathhouses in Chicago. Is that correct?
That's my understanding. He estimated he made about 10 trips to Chicago and 2 nights per trip. He went down there after he was committing the homicides at his residence. He went down to Chicago to find someone to bring back to his residence and keep them. I use the word scouting trip. 2 people came back with him. He found or met the first one at a Chicago bus stop, and the second one came from a bar in Chicago, and he gave the name of the bar. Both these individuals he killed back in Milwaukee. He said, quote, just the distance was greater. The Chicago guys had definite time limits, meaning they couldn't stay that long in Milwaukee. I liked Chicago better, greater variety, better nightclubs, unquote. He then said that killing them was not the satisfying part. He's referring to the victims in general. Quote, killing was just a means to an end, unquote. And the issue here is that is the actual taking of life sexually arousing or stimulating in a sexually sadistic way, because there is such a thing as a sadomasochistic behavior. And he repeatedly stated that this was not sexually sadistic or that he was getting any joy or arousal from the killing. It was a step he had to take to achieve his desired end. He said, quote, killing was just a means to an end, unquote. He then brought up the zombie issue, which we'll get to later, but then he went back to, I questioned him more about the motive for the killing. He said, quote, no, I didn't get a kick out of that at all. That's why I tried to make it as painless as possible. While they were asleep, I wasn't into torture, unquote. He also said the homicides were not, quote, hate-motivated crimes, unquote. 7 out of the 17 were not black, and therefore they were not racially motivated crimes. And he was saying this as an attempt to disclaim any of the allegations against him. He said Mr. Hicks and Cash D and the last victim were not gay, and he mentioned possibly some others were not gay also. He said these individuals came back to his residence for money, and he called them, quote, hustler type, unquote, prostitutes, unquote, heterosexual men who prostituted themselves for money. Therefore, his motivation was not homosexual hate crimes. Quote, I was not targeting any particular race. Hate was not my motive. Lust was, he said. Then he again stated that the killing was not, and the dismembering was not part of his sexual act. While at his third residence, he did go to bookstores for sexual purposes.
I just interrupt at that point.
The lust you're speaking of is the lust for sex?
Sexual lust. Desire. At his third residence, he did not go to bookstores for sexual purposes. He just went to Chicago or used his apartment. He was no longer using hotels. He made the comment about the bathhouse business and So they call themselves health clubs, but their, quote, their real business is a homosexual brothel, unquote. He said these facilities are open, quote, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, unquote. He then said, quote, I wanted a remembrance to keep, unquote. He then boiled and painted the skulls, and he had a complete skeleton. And when I asked him if he, again, had any pleasure or excitement out of killing them, he said, quote, that's a misconception, unquote. And then I asked him what he thought was wrong with him. And he said, quote, my consuming lust to experience their bodies, the desire never left. There were times I couldn't fulfill it because of the time and work reasons. The focus of my life was to find fulfillment and satisfaction with good-looking guys. Cannibalism and the saving of body parts were just offshoots. It's his words. Just having them there for a few nights was not enough. Then I got into the offshoots. They couldn't be kept indefinitely. So we're kind of starting a new phase here where we grow from a few hours of a drug state to a few days, to a few hours to a few days of a deceased body phase, and now we're into having some mementos after the body has to be disposed of. He said the bodies could be left intact for a few days and then he would have to dispose of them. He expressed surprise that the last body decomposed so rapidly and that there's some maggots on the face within a couple days. He would kill them and use their bodies for a few days. Before the body decomposed, he said that 2 or 3 days tops, meaning 2 or 3 days max, that he could have access to their bodies for sexual purposes. He would, quote, lay around body rubbing, masturbation, and anal sex, unquote, with the bodies. He said he never heard of any gay person drugging his sexual contacts or killing his contacts in order to keep them. Quote, I wasn't trying to imitate anyone. All the ideas came from within, unquote. Then he mentioned an article.
Is it an article that has been published?
Comparing him to another person?
Perhaps. He said, quote, I carried it much too far, comma, that's for sure, unquote, meaning his sexual behavior. He said it was common that his contacts would want to stay, but they couldn't, and they had to leave, and thus he had to kill them to keep them, which is pretty unfortunate. He said, I was, quote, I was trying to think of a way to not have to kill them, unquote. And then we discussed his, quote, zombie, unquote, cases. That was his word. He said he would drill a small hole through the top of the skull and into the brain. And he did this on about 4 or 5 victims. He used a baster. He described where he got it. And he injected diluted muriatic acid into the skull. And this was the same acid he used to, quote, acidify the skeletons, half acid and half water. He then said the body parts would get, quote, mushy, unquote, and he would flush the mixture down the toilet. He would scoop it out of the barrel after about 2 weeks and put it in the toilet. He said he kept 11 skulls. Quote, some didn't dry out so well, so I destroyed them, unquote.
Could you just pause a minute?
Have there been discussion of how he was disposing of the flesh, or basically the bones, when you're talking now about the apartment building on North 25th, is that correct?
Yeah, that discussion comes later. This whole interview was trying to get an overall time frames and some degree of categorization as to where things are going on, and we weren't into the specific names yet.
There's a later, more detailed discussion about the disposal.
He said drilling the hole in the skull was, quote, an experiment. It never worked out, unquote. Said he tried this technique on his last 4 or 5 victims. He put acid in the hole on 4 of the victims and boiling water in 1 of the victims. He said the 5 individuals did not get into a, quote, zombie, unquote, state. He said he injected them while they were drugged. He wanted the individuals to be, this is the motive for the drilling, he wanted the individuals to be, quote, open to my suggestion. I wanted an indefinite effect, unquote. The purpose was that they would be alive, the bodies would be preserved, but their personality would be, quote, zombied, so I wouldn't have to go out looking for partners, unquote. So this is an attempt to start a new routine or pattern. He put acid into the skulls of 4 individuals. On the first one, he injected the acid twice and the individual was killed. On the individual he injected with boiling water, he said, quote, he was up and about for 1 day after the injection. This is after being questioned. I had to work, so I gave him a 2nd dose of boiling water and left for work. When I returned the next morning, he had expired, unquote. He said this individual was the one he picked up at the bar in Chicago, Mr. Weinberger. He would inject while the individual was asleep or passed out. And then I asked him, I said, and he said he's told this to other doctors and his attorney. When asked, he said this individual was, quote, up and about, unquote, for 1 day. He said this victim seemed, quote, seemed tired. He talked in short sentences. He seemed confused. We didn't have any sexual contact. I was more interested in finishing the 12-pack in the fridge, unquote.
You tell the jury what
Inferences you drew from that. Mr. Weinberger has survived the initial drilling and insertion of the acid, and he departs for a while, returns, and finds him still about, up and about, or not at least alive, but does not turn to exercise the sexual activities with him. Did you draw any inferences or conclusions from that, or observations?
From what I recall, as he was talking about this, the main thing was this experiment. This was a major thing for him. You have to appreciate his goal is to have this completely cooperative, passive individual that will let him do whatever Mr. Dahmer, wants to do sexually. And that's what he's trying to strive for. But the drawback of killing people is that, that has its drawbacks also. The work involved, the disposal problem, he wanted a different approach, and this is one he was experimenting with. So I think during that time, his involvement with the experiment and the procedures, I think took priority in an experimental way, and that maybe his sexual behavior with him had less priority. And perhaps that's why he did not involve himself sexually. When asked, he said he tried to be as, quote, painless as possible, unquote, when he killed the victims. When asked how he did this, he said he strangled them while they were passed out, quote, all except for the last 4 or 5 victims, unquote, referring to the drilling. He remembered the names of these last victims as being Lindsay, a deaf-mute individual, the Laotian, and Weinberger. When asked if he stabbed one of the victims, he said that he, quote, forgot, unquote. He said that he stabbed Miller, quote, because the pills were wearing off, unquote, and he cut Miller's neck. He said he kept all 4 of the skulls from the victims at grandmother's house for a few days and then, quote, disposed of them. Dash, I didn't feel safe keeping them They would have been discovered while I was at work, unquote. So he's living at grandmother's, he's got some skulls at home, and he's off at work. So he's concerned about that. He did keep the skull of the last grandmother case. And again, he's not, it refers to the individual met at the cage. In regard to the other 12, he said he did not keep 2 of the skulls because they, quote, did not dry out well, unquote. Kept 11 skulls total. Painted them with spray paint, quote, fake granite, to give them an artificial appearance. So when I displayed them in the bedroom, so they wouldn't look real, to be on the safe side, so they would look like artificial skulls. If they looked real, I would get in trouble. In case of a break-in, to play it safe, it also gave them a uniform appearance after the bleaching. My interpretation here is that, and I asked him about it, he said, indeed, if his place was broken into like anybody else is broken into, that the robber or the burglar, even though the burglar is committing a crime on Mr. Dahmer's apartment, he was concerned about the actual robber turning him into the police. So here, let's say one criminal is reporting another criminal, so to speak. So that's why the artificial paint, and this, again, I infer it clearly reflects that he was aware of the wrongfulness of his behavior. When asked what he was worried about, he said that he was concerned about a possible break-in and the burglar reporting him to the police, and he agreed with me that he was concerned about getting caught. He said, quote, I did everything in my power so that wouldn't happen. I went to great pains to not be discovered, unquote.
The court at about
3 minutes to 12. I'm not sure what the court's agenda is. We're going
That's a good breaking point, sure.
to.
We'll break for lunch, and how about coming back at 1 o'clock?
Right.
For some reasons.
All right, please.